Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ms. Palisa Ramabodu, and I am a history teacher currently working at Bulamasango High School. And the purpose of today's presentation is that I am going to be walking you guys into the exam room. You are no longer called learners, right? You are called candidates. And the presentation will be based on the History Paper 1's examination tips. That is between the content phrase of 2021 to 2023. Before I continue, I would just like to send a special request or a special dedication to the kids of Bulamasango, the grade 12s of Bulamasango and across the Free State, and also the kids or the learners or the candidates of Lefikeng High School at U Section Butshabelo, because I've been working with them for these past few days and you guys have been amazing. So I will start my presentation, and with the start of this presentation, I hope it is visible on the screen. We are live. I'm going to look at the contents for paper 1. So we know that we have two papers, paper 1 and paper 2. And for paper 1, the focus of this question paper is that usually it is divided into 6 sections. Now we've got source-based questions and essay questions, and you have to choose 3. We know that the question paper consists out of 150, and each question is 50 marks, each allocated 1 hour. Now, you have to choose 3 questions. It's either 2 source-based questions and 1 essay, or you choose 1 source-based questions and 2 essays. At the end of the paper, you must have answered 3. You cannot answer 3 essay questions. You cannot answer 3 source-based questions. At least there needs to be a balance. Now, with the source-based questions, there are 3. We've got Cold War with origins of the Cold War. We've got independent Africa on question 2 with Angola. And then we've got question 3 with civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. And in this case, it is the American Civil Rights Movement. And then the essay questions, we've got question 4 with extension of the Cold War. The content focus here is Vietnam. And then question 5, we have independent Africa, which is the essay Congo. And then question 6 is civil society protests from 1950s to the 1970s. And the focus here is Black Power movement. Now, I want us to zoom into question 1. The question focus of this is we are moving into the end of World War II, and the introduction is why did Cold War develop, with special focus on the USSR and the USA and the creation of the spheres of influence, the installation of Soviet-friendly satellite states, the USA's policy of containment through the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Crisis of 1949 to 1961, and opposing military alliances, which is called NATO and Warsaw Pact. And with the end of this question, we also need to understand who was to blame for the Cold War. And then the other source-based question, question 2, which is Angola. Angola, you need to understand colonialism and independence and the outbreak of the civil war in 1974 that is between the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA. Also, the other focus is the reasons for and the nature of involvement in Angola from international societies such as the USSR, USA, Cuba, China, and South Africa. And here we look at the impact on regional stability. And we also look at the significance of the Battle of Quito Carnival of 1987 and 1988 and the changing nature of international relationship. Now, the source-based question, which is 3, the American Civil Rights Movement. We must focus on the reasons and the origins of the civil rights, the movement in the USA, the role, impact, and influence of Martin Luther King Jr., the influence of passive resistance, the impact that he got from Mahatma Gandhi on Martin Luther King Jr., forms of protest through civil disobedience with special focus on the Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the marches, including the Lincoln Memorial, Birmingham marches. And then we also focus on the campaign and the Selma to Montgomery marches, school desegregation with the case study of the Little Rock in Arkansas. And then we also need to look at the short-term and the long-term gains. Now, going to section 2 of the essay, which is the essay questions. Question 4, we have Vietnam. And then with Vietnam, we need to understand the stages of the war from 1957 to 1965, which is the struggle in Vietnam between South Vietnamese army and the communist-trained rebel known as the Viet Cong. And then we also need to, the stages of the war are actually sequenced chronologically. The second stage is the 1965 to 1969, the North Vietnamese struggle, which includes the nature of this Vietnamese war. Listen, I just want to make you familiar with these concepts and these stages. As I go through the content of the essay, I am not going through it as a lesson, but I just want to familiarize you with this particular content, meaning your essay needs to at least include these contents. And then next we have the war from the Vietnamese and the USA's perspective, the war as a global issue, and 1969 to 1975, the USA's withdrawal from Vietnam and how it impacted United States of America's politics and the student movement. And then question 5, we have Congo. And with Congo, as you see, it is highlighted. We need to look at political, social, and economic. What were the ideas that influenced the Congo? What are the political influences, the type of leader, legacies of colonialism, the type of government, political stability and instability? Meaning your essay needs to include the type of leader that Mobutu Sese Seko was, the legacy of colonialism, what did he do with that, the type of government that he installed, the political stability or instability that occurred in Congo after he had become or before he had become president. And then the economic or the type of economy that he had introduced after he was put on as president, the social and cultural successes and challenges that Congo faced. What are the benefits of independence on education and Africanization? And then with question 6, this is the Black Power movement. And with the Black Power movement, we need to understand what were the reasons that the Black Power movement emerged, why was the Black Panther Party formed, what was the Black Panther Party, what was it all about? And then we need to look at the role of leadership, and I do not only want to focus on Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, but we also need to flow into other leaders such as Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, which were leaders of the Black Panther Party, and other African American activists. So in this case, you are allowed to go as free as you want with the leadership of the Black Power movement. And then lastly, we also need to acknowledge the short-term and the long-term gains. As you see, this it's not a long essay. You need to put your heart, your mind, and your soul into this one if you did it. Right, now we are entering the second phase of our presentation, which is how are source-based questions, meaning we are entering the second phase, which is the skill side. Now we are looking at how this question paper is divided. Now we've got 3 cognitive levels. We've got level 1, we've got level 2, we've got level 3. For level 1, it is 14 marks. And this is where you are required to extract evidence from the source, define the terms in your own words. And then level 2, we've got interpretation of evidence from the sources, where you explain information gathered from the sources. And here you get 20 marks, meaning 40% of this question of the marks are given to level 2 questions. So this means that you have to put your focus. You need to go and study. You need to be familiar with the content so that you are not surprised when you come across the addendum. And then you also need to explain concepts in context, and then you also need to analyze evidence from the sources. Now with level 2, this is where we get to see how well you have prepared. And with also level 2, this is where we get to see how well you know your content. You are not rewarded marks for taking the content as it is from the source. This is where you actually get to analyze this information. This is where you get to interpret this information and not paraphrase it as it comes from the source. And then level 3 questions, This is where you interpret and you evaluate evidence from the sources. This is where you engage with the source to determine its usefulness, its reliability, bias, and limitation. And also this is where you get to compare sources and compare and contrast evidence from the sources. Lastly, this is where you get to use the skills of writing your paragraph. And if you check the marks, it's 16 marks. Right, with the level 1 questions, you are required to extract information, as I said. And then how do we identify our level 1 questions? We see what information in the source tells you about, or quote 2 reasons from the source. What do you understand by the term, or define in your own words? And then question verbs you will get from this particular level is list, quote, identify, name, mention. And then these questions carry a maximum of 2 marks. So it's either 1 times 1, 2 times 1, or 1 times 2. And 1 times 2, we usually get it whenever you are required to define. And then the level 2 questions require you to interpret, as I said previously. And these types of questions carry maximum marks of 4 marks. And it is divided as 2 times 2. And then the question verbs for these particular questions is explain, comment, describe, organize. Now, the type of questions, typical questions would rather be, what message does the cartoon convey? Yes, what message does the cartoon convey? Explain in your own words, why do you think, what do you think is meant by, explain the context explain the concept in the context of, and comment on. So this is how you're going to identify that this is my level 2 question. And then level 3 questions require you to explain different perspectives, draw conclusion, and determine whether a source is reliable, a source is useful, or if the source has any limitation. How do we know about level 3 questions? They carry a maximum mark of 4. We know it's 2 times 2, and then the question verbs usually are compare, contrast, comment. And then also examples of level 3 questions would be compare the evidence in source 1A and source 1B, and you will also identify by the 2 times 2 and 4 within the brackets. Or you can also see comment on the usefulness of the information in source 1B. And next we also see that paragraph writing using the information and evidence from relevant sources to write a paragraph about. So this is how you identify your questions. So mark allocation, what does it mean? This is where many of the candidates are making mistakes. They do not look at the mark allocation. Now, I usually give advice as to whenever you get the question paper, quickly just identify your level 1 questions. Identify your level 2 questions, identify your level 3 questions, and how do you also identify them? Through mark allocation. Now, let us look at the first one. We have 1 times 2 equals to 2. 1 means the number of responses that is needed. In other words, if it's 1 times 2, you are required to answer once, and then if it's 2 times 2, you are required to answer twice. And then mark allocation, what does it mean on the left-hand side? On the right-hand side, 4 times 1. You are required to give 4 facts for 1 marks each, meaning you're going to get 4 marks. And then if it's 2 times 2, it means you give 2 facts for 2 marks each, which is going to give you 4 marks. This is like the math slit of history, where we need to understand how marks are allocated and why do we get to certain answers, or how do we get to certain marks. Now, if you see the mark allocation of 1 times 1, we know it's 1. 2 times 1, 3 times 1, we know that that's an extraction. And if you see an allocation of marks as 1 times 2, then you go and look into the source first, and then your answer might be there. Or look at the way the question is phrased. It might be telling you to look at the source. And how will you know if it's requiring you to look at the source? It will say according to source A or according to source B. Right, and then if you see a mark allocation of 2 times 2, this means that it's an interpretation or analysis question, meaning you need to have learned your work. This is where background knowledge is required. This is where you are showing us that you have studied and that whether you go back to the source, it means that you understand what is being asked and you need to apply your knowledge and understanding in order to answer the question. Do not copy an answer from the source NB. Very important. Put it in your own words as much as possible. Do not make the mistake of level 2 questions and then you take it as it is and you put it into the source. The other mistake that many candidates like to make is that they will take information from the top of the source and then they put it into the answer. You will not be credited. You will be disqualified. And then remember, you look at the mark allocation of the question. That will guide you whether the answer in the source is an extraction or whether you have to interpret it or provide analysis. Now, the types of questions is that how do sources support each other? Compare or contrast questions, usefulness of sources, reliability of sources, limitations of sources, the value of appropriate conjunction. Now, when sources support each other, you find questions such as, how does source 1A support source 1B with regards to? This is a comparison question where you are required to look at the similarities of both sources. And then what do you also need to identify? What do these sources have in common? Now, what do you do in this case? You go to source 1A and you find something in that source that is supported or that shows the same thing that you see in source 1B. In your answer, you will say, in source 1A, it is stated that, and in source 1B, in this case, if it's a visual source, you will say, and source 1B portrays or shows that this is this way. And this is the comparison between textual, written, and visual source. So whenever you will be asked about to support, to compare sources that are supporting each other, in most cases, it is when it is a visual source or a written source. And then you go back to find another example of something that the two sources have in common. Now, also, this is one of the mistakes that candidates like to make. They only compare once. Guys, it's 4 marks. That means you compare first and then you compare again. You don't just compare once and then you think it's, oh no, I'm done. You need to go back to the sources and to find something that is worth the other 2 marks. Remember, we are not doing source-based questions so that we can just pass, but we are also doing source-based questions in order to get those distinctions. And then comparing for contrast, you are taking these 2 sources and then you are looking at how these sources are contradicting each other or what are the opposing messages of these sources to each other. And now what do? You first go to the source and find something that is the opposite of or that is contradicted by the second source. In your answer, you will say, source 1A refers to, while source 1B states this. And if you look at the answer, it needs to show contradiction. It needs to show differences. It does not need to look the same, like when you answer for sources that support each other. And then you go back and find another example of something that the 2 sources have that is contradiction or an opposite. So once again, you do not just compare once, you need, please. And then we look at usefulness and reliability. Usefulness of the source, what is the source being used for? How relevant is this source for my investigation? And what you need to look at is how reliable is the source. Is it accurate? Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated with other sources? Who produced it? What was the purpose of this source being produced? And now you need to focus on the message of the source. Assess whether the information in the source can either be used for the period, the event under discussion. And then same consideration, provenance, origins of the source, and the content of the source can be used to determine both usefulness and reliability according to the policy guidelines. Now, what this means is that both usefulness and reliability, it is actually one and the same thing. Meaning you can also answer usefulness as though you asking yourself if the source is trustworthy. And then also reliability goes hand in hand with what you respond to, usefulness. And then limitations. How is this source limited? The kind of questions point to the quality of the source. What is missing in the source? How rich of this information appears to be in the source? So you will be looking at things like bias and reliability, and this will then point you to the direction of whether the source is useful or not. So whenever you're going to come across a question of limitation, you need to first look at if the source is biased, one-sided, or if the source is reliable. Can you trust it? Does the information reflect accuracy? Is the source useful? And then, for example, the source may be limited if it only presents one side or one point of view, meaning the source can be limited if it is biased, or it can be limited because the source is not accurate, it is not consistent with other sources, meaning it is not reliable. Now, you can also state that the source is limited. And then we come to the interesting part, the paragraphs. Now, the focus of the skill is that you need to identify relevant evidence from the sources. You need to integrate relevant own knowledge. Now, let me speak about the two information. The first information means that whenever you read, whenever you go through these sources, whatever you pick up that is relevant for you, the usefulness of the source, just write it down under the particular source. 2-3 facts. That is what I say. And then you're going to integrate that information with the information that you have learned when you were at home. And then you also need to understand that your paragraphs need to be coherent. You do not need to write in bullets. And then the length of your paragraph, because usually it says between a paragraph of 8 lines, 80 words, we need to stick to the rules. You cannot go beyond that. And then referencing of sources. Now this is where it gets hard. So you either choose to reference, or the markers will be able to identify if the source has been referenced and where the source has been picked up. Now the question is worth 8 marks and it is assessed holistically. We are using an analytical rubric, and this question is phrased as a level 3 question. 8 marks, meaning 16% of your marks are allocated for paragraph. So you cannot play. You shouldn't play. You should go all in for the 8 marks. And then the question, for example, explain the role, the impact, the causes, the effects, or the significance of a particular historical event. And then the paragraph questions always relates back to the key questions. And then using the information, this is the example of a paragraph question. It will either say using the information from relevant sources and your own knowledge. So it means you are not only obligated to have write from sources, but you also need to add your own knowledge to write a paragraph explaining, for instance, the significance, the causes, the effects, and the impact. And then this is what you're going to do. You need to read through the sources, and this needs to take place when you are starting with your question. As you're reading the sources, you need to underline relevant facts in each source that answers the question. Which question? The key question. You need to transfer these facts on a clean page. Now, this is where I said, whenever you read the source, just jot down, just under the source, what is it that you are picking up, these relevant facts. Number 3, you need to remember other contents that relates to the question, content from your textbook, and contents that you were taught in class. This is very important. This is where you bring in the information that you have learned. This is where you bring in the knowledge that you have acquired throughout the year. And then you are going to mix it, and then it is going to be used as your own information to write this paragraph. And then remember to reference your sources. But as you reference your sources, you do not quote the source, because you will not be granted marks. You do not have to say, in source 1A, Kennedy said all you need to do is to write down the relevant information, and then after you put the relevant source in brackets. So you don't need to specifically reference, you just need to write, and then you can put in the brackets where you got the source, where you got the information. Now with the essay, this is the third phase of the question paper or the presentation. We are looking at the essays, my favorite. There are 3 types of essay questions. These 3 questions are as follows. You will either be asked if you agree, you will either be asked to what extent, or you will either be asked to critically discuss, meaning you will be asked to look at both sides, the good and the bad, the successes or failures. Now you need to look at the questions you have been asked, and then you need to identify the question verb. Is it agree? Is it to what extent? Or is it critically discuss? And then you identify the topic point, meaning what is the focus of the essay? And then what is the restrictive weight? Is there a date? What is the argument based on? I'll give you examples later on. And then your introduction, and I need to make side note. Introduction is the way to get the attention of the marker. The kids were emphasizing that the powerful the introduction, the more powerful the essay is going to be, the body or the information of the essay. Now, in your introduction, remember, if you are asked to agree, then you need to take a stance for all 3 questions. Whether you are asked to agree, to what extent, or critically discuss, a stance need to be taken. You take a stance whether you agree or you disagree, to what extent. For critically discuss, you need to take a stance, but in connection with what you have been asked to critically discuss. Remember that. And then what is going to be discussed? What is going to be the content of your essay? What is going to be inside your essay? You need to give us the prediction. You need to keep us on our seats when we read your introduction. And then, very, very importantly, line of argument, meaning what do you think? What is your opinion? After giving us what your essay is going to be discussed. Now, in the case of agreeing essay question, I will make an example with the Vietnam essay. Now, the statement says, the military tactics and strategies used by the United States of America against the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War failed to stop the Vietnam from becoming a communist state. And then the question will say, do you agree with the statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. Now, a possible introduction. If you look at the green on the presentation, of course, if you're watching it live, you take a stance that it can be agreed that the military tactics of the USA against the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War failed. Meaning the statement that was given up there that these tactics of the USA failed, you agree. And then you give us the content. And this says, this essay will look at, or the essay will focus, the essay will discuss, the essay will outline. The strategic Hamlet program, this is where now you mention what your essay is going to entail. And then you need to go and look into the line of argument. And in this case, we say the Vietnamization tactics used by the Viet Cong in order to show that the military tactics and strategies used by the USA failed to help them win the war and therefore prevent Vietnam from becoming a communist. So this is where the candidate has stated their line of argument. So look at it again. You took a stance. You gave us what the essay is going to entail, and then lastly, you need to state your line of argument. Please, for a complete introduction, take a stance, give us what your essay is going to discuss, and lastly, you need to state your line of argument. Now, continuing, To what extent, essay question. Now, in this case, we are using the example of the Black Power movement. It says, explain to what extent the Black Power philosophy succeeded in organizing African Americans to challenge discrimination and segregation in the United States of America in the 1960s. To what extent? Possible introduction, you need to take a stance again. To a large extent, to a great extent, the Black Power philosophy succeeded. And if you look closely, the statement, the question statement is being repeated. And then content, it says, this essay will look at the reasons for the Black Power movement, the philosophy, the aims of the Black Power movement, the roles of leadership, and the roles of Black Panther Party in order to show. This is where you identify, or this is where you make the person who's going to be reading this essay that now your line of argument is coming in. To show that the Black Power philosophy organized African Americans to have pride and self-reliance in order to challenge discrimination and segregation in the USA. And then as we continue, for critically discuss essay question. Now, we are using this critically discuss essay question for the topic of Congo. And then it says, with reference to the political, economical, social, and cultural policies of the Congo, critically discuss whether Mobutu Sese Seko demonstrated good leadership qualities after the attainment of independence from colonial rule in the 1960s. Now, here, you need to take a stance whether it is good or bad. Taking a stance would mean you would say Mobutu Sese Seko did demonstrate good leadership qualities with regards to social and cultural policies of the Congo in the 1960s. However, can you see, the response here is demonstrating good and bad. However, he did not demonstrate good leadership qualities in the political and economical policies that he implemented. Now, the content, this essay will look at Mobutu's political, economical, social, and cultural policies that he implemented in Congo after the attainment of independence from colonial rule in order to prove, this is where you chip in the line of argument, that while he had successes in the areas, he also had failures. So, if you look at this line of argument also, it has both good and bad. So with critically discuss, you are not obligated to stick to one side of the story. You are obligated, you are actually instructed to look at both the good and the bad. And then for the body, your body of your essay, now you need to throw in relevant factual material that will be used to defend or to argue your point. And it must be chronological. You must not just throw your information without any sequence. It does not work like that. Be chronological. Be strict with chronology. And then examples will include the strategy of PEEL. P being your point or your fact. E where you explain what the point that you're trying to make. The other state your line of argument that this strategy therefore failed. And then let us look at PEEL in the context of the Black Power movement. First of all, we look at the role of Stokely Kameka, and we just took an example of role of Stokely Carmichael. You mentioned the role of Stokely Carmichael. You explain who he was and how he became involved in the Black Power movement. You provide evidence as to what role he played, what did he do, how did he do it, and how successful it was. And then lastly, you link it back to the question that you have been asked and where you state your line of argument. And then lastly, peel strategy with regards to Mobutu Sese Seko. Now, the point is, Mobutu came into power by a military coup. In this case, we are looking at political. He came into power by a military coup and introduced a one-party state. You are making an example. You are making your point. You explain this point by saying he introduced the one-party state. There were no multi-party election. Opposition was silenced. Independence was characterized by violence and political upheaval. And then lastly, you will also mention, you link it back to your introduction where you state that truly or indeed Mobutu Sese Seko's leadership skills were very poor because he was a dictator. And then with conclusion, this is like the cherry on top, the cream of the cream. You do not add any new evidence. You do not subtract anything. This is where you sum up your main points and that you have made in your body of your essay, and then you restate the main line of argument. And then you round off your argument by reverting back to the question. Right. So, with this essay, with the conclusion, I will also make an example with the Vietnam. I will make an example with conclusion of Vietnam. Now, since you had said that the military tactics of the USA had failed to defeat the Viet Cong, then you were going to say, in summary, in conclusion, it is indeed clear from the above discussion that the military tactics and strategies of the USA were a failure, and therefore they failed to crush the Viet Cong. That is your conclusion. If you make an example of, if we make an example of the conclusion for the Black Power movement, then you are going to say, in summary or in conclusion, conclusively, it is evident from the above discussion that the Black Power philosophy indeed succeeded in organizing African Americans to challenge the Black Power movement and to inspire African Americans to have pride and self-reliance. Now, this is where you just summarize it. And then also, lastly, with Mobutu Sese Seko, you're going to say, in conclusion, indeed, the above discussion shows that Mobutu Sese Seko showed good leadership qualities, whereas he was able to show the successes, but also areas where he had failed. Now, I have come to the end of my presentation. I hope that this information has been useful. Go back to your teachers if there are any questions or any clarity about the things that I had presented about. Otherwise, it was a great pleasure to present this, and I hope that this information has been useful. Thank you very much.